The Pivot to Asia plan from the Obama administration turns 10 years old next month. The plan aims to expand economic potential, advance democracy, and create a military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. But the U.S. has fallen short. That's according to Zack Cooper. He's senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's writing about foreign policy with China for Foreign Affairs magazine. Zack, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
You say that there's, quote, a disconnect between ambitious rhetoric and underwhelming action when it comes to the U.S. relationship with Asia. Explain that.
Well, if you think back about a decade when the Obama administration announced that the U.S. would be rebalancing towards the Asia Pacific, we said that we were going to make a whole commitment to the region, right? We were going to move our military more in that direction. We were going to increase our economic engagement with the region. We were going to promote democracy and human rights there. And I think if you look back at the last decade, the results are pretty meager. We've tried to increase our military presence, but actually there hasn't been that much of a change. In fact, if you read President Obama's speech from 2011, he talked a lot about how getting out of Afghanistan would mean more of a U.S. presence in the Asia Pacific. And of course, we're still in the middle of this right now. On the economic side, we haven't really had any clear trade or investment strategy since the U.S. pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership a few years ago. And then on human rights and democracy, we've seen backsliding actually throughout much of the region and in the United States. So I think if you look at the key priorities that we have had in Asia over the last decade, it's very hard to say that we've accomplished them.
And you're not seeing much focus from the Biden administration, is that correct, on Asia?
They came in really promising to focus much more on Asia, and I think they've done quite a good job with some of our key allies, Japan, Korea, to some extent Australia, and then with a few partners as well. We've really seen progress with India and with Taiwan. Where I think they're struggling is in Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, this is much of the region, right? There's 650 million people in Southeast Asia. Countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam are absolutely critical. And we just haven't put the energy into that part of the region that we've put in elsewhere.
So what do you think the current administration's biggest priority should be for Asia?
I think the most important thing what our Asian friends want to see from us is a positive trade and investment approach. And unfortunately, this is a real challenge for the administration. The White House keeps promoting what it calls a foreign policy for the middle class. And when you hear them talk about this, often it seems to mean that they don't support a broader trade and investment plan for the region because they don't think it would support the American people in the way that it should. And so this leaves many in Asia very confused about what you can actually do for them, right? Of course, many in Asia want more U.S. engagement on the military side, but their top priority is really their economic development. And so if we can't find a way to support them in those endeavors, it's going to be very hard for us to get traction in the region over time.
Well, let's talk about China's military strength. What would you say, Zack, is the balance of power right now between the U.S. and China in the Pacific?
I do think the United States still has a bit of an upper hand, although it's a declining upper hand, and the balance is getting much closer than it's been at any point in recent memory. And of course, this means that the one contingency that many of us are most worried about, a possible fight over Taiwan, is becoming slightly more likely as time goes on. And I think certainly as we get towards 2025 and 2030 or 2035, that military balance is going to become more and more concerning. And so from an American perspective, we need to be doing everything we can with our key allies and partners, countries like Japan and indeed the Philippines, to reinforce the U.S. presence in the region and to make sure that we have a strong deterrent capability. But the trends are very much against us at the moment.
So policy-wise, what do you recommend defense-wise? Do you recommend we go all in on the Pacific? And is that doable? Can we do that?
The United States has global responsibilities, and I don't think that's going to change. But I do think the balance of where we put our time and our resources has to change to some degree. That doesn't mean we aren't going to keep investing in our relationships in the Middle East or our alliance in Europe. But it does mean that, in my view at least, when the United States thinks hard about where it has to prioritize, that Asia should be the #1 region. In part, that's because our allies in Europe They want cooperation from us, and we should certainly give it to them. But they're capable, if they get their act together, of dealing with the challenge from Russia. That's not the same in Asia. If we leave our friends in Asia alone to deal with China, they will have no choice but to bandwagon with Beijing. And so we have to stand up firmly in Asia. And that means putting real resources into the region. And frankly, that's just something we haven't done since we announced the rebalance to Asia over a decade ago. So I think it's about time that we actually put our money where our mouth is.
Very quickly, Zack, on human rights and promoting human rights, that's always been a priority, but how do you actually do that?
It's really hard. I think the first thing is we learned the last few years that if you don't talk about human rights, you certainly are not upholding them. So we have to push back against repression in Hong Kong, genocide in Xinjiang, and these other kinds of human rights violations that we have to stand up and talk about them, because if we don't do it, no one else will. I also think, though, that doesn't mean that we can't cooperate with other countries who aren't perfect democracies or even aren't democracies at all. We've got to find ways to work with all of the allies and partners that we have in the region and not insist that they transform overnight, but just push them slowly towards these key values that we think are so important. So it's a long project, but I do think it has to be part of how we see our long-term vision for the region.
All right, Zack, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.